Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zoom. Today I will talk to you about mini story for Day of the Dead. Okay, so now let's start.
Okay, let's begin. Okay, here we go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Oh.
Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala.
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Oh.
Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
It's me, AJ.
Well, me, AJ, right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
On November 3rd, I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Oh.
Was I angry about this holiday?
No. I was curious about this holiday.
About this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No. I was curious about this holiday.
I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
I was, AJ.
Oh, I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
The holiday. I was curious about the holiday.
I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about? Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
About the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead, or was I curious about Christmas?
No, I was curious, about the Day of the Dead.
The Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
To the cemetery.
To the cemetery.
I went to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery, or did I go to the airport?
No, I went to the cemetery.
I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
It's me, AJ.
Right, AJ.
I went to the cemetery.
Where did I go? To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
November 1st. I went to the cemetery on November 1st.
Right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st? Why did I go to the cemetery?
Because to see what was happening.
To see what was happening.
I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
Me, AJ.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
In Guatemala.
In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is
a holiday. The
holiday.
Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
November 1st. The Day of the Dead
1st.
was
the Day of the Dead
on November 1st.
Was and is November 1st. Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting.
Oh.
Was it boring?
No. It was interesting.
It wasn't boring. Was it interesting? Yes. It was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery?
I felt it was interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting.
The cemetery was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting?
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead.
It was interesting
November 1st.
The Day of the Dead. November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
Oh.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
No. The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
The atmosphere was happy.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was
like a party. Okay, that's all about my sharing. Thank you so much for your attention. Goodbye.